There is a scale in that kitchen that reads to 1/10 of a gram. It sits on a shelf away from the line, because what gets weighed on it is worth more per gram than anything else in the building, and steam would ruin it. The chef uses it about 4 times a service. Twice a week from November to February, a small insulated box arrives at the back door. What's inside gets logged, weighed, and packed in rice in a sealed container in the walk-in. And every time somebody opens that container, the whole cold room smells like something that has been underground. Cooks who work there ask where it comes from. She tells them a farm about 2 hours out. That's true. She tells them the number of acres, and that always surprises them, because the number is 9. What none of them picture, what nobody in that kitchen has any reason to picture, is the ground it grows on. They imagine a forest, somewhere green and old and European. It is a limestone hillside in ordinary farm country, too rocky to plow, too thin to grow corn on. Nobody wanted it for 90 years. And a young man leased it, on purpose, specifically because nothing else would grow there. Silas Renner was 26 and had a master's degree in mycology, which in that county was roughly as useful as a degree in Latin. He'd grown up 2 counties over on a grain farm that his older brother now ran. He had come home with a specialty, the study of fungi, particularly the ones that live in partnership with tree roots, and no realistic way to make a living from it inside 400 miles. He had $11,000, most of it saved out of a graduate stipend he had been unusually careful with, and he had a plan that he learned very quickly not to explain in full to anybody, because explaining it in full produced a specific facial expression he got tired of seeing. The short version was that he wanted to grow truffles. The long version, the one that made people's eyes do the thing, was that he wanted to do it on the worst ground he could find. Every farmer in that county spent their working life fighting limestone. It came up through the soil on the ridges and the north-facing slopes, in shelves and slabs and loose broken rock that snapped tillage shanks and made a field a nuisance to work. Where the limestone was close to the surface, the soil over it was thin and pale and dried out fast in July, and the corn on it was short and disappointing every single year without exception. Those acres got farmed anyway, badly, out of stubbornness, or they got left to brush. Ilma Vosberg had 9 such acres on the north end of her place and had not made $1 off them since the Eisenhower administration. She ran cattle on the good ground and mowed the rocky hill twice a year to keep the multiflora rows down. And that was the entire economic history of that hillside. What Silas Renner saw when he stood on that hillside was not poor ground. It was the one specific soil chemistry that the fungus he wanted requires, and that almost nowhere else in that county could offer. Because the thing that makes limestone ruinous for corn is exactly the thing a truffle needs. The rock keeps the soil alkaline, high pH, the opposite of what most crops want. Corn hates it, soybeans hate it. It locks up iron and manganese and leaves the plants yellow and stunted. The truffle fungus does not merely tolerate that, it requires it. Below a certain pH, the fungus will not colonize a tree root at all, no matter what else you do, no matter how much you spend. 90 years of that hillside being worthless was 90 years of it being perfectly preserved for exactly one purpose that nobody had thought of. He drove up her lane in April and asked to lease it. Ilma Vosberg was 78, had buried a husband and outlived most of her opinions about what young people ought to do with themselves, and she listened to about 90 seconds of his explanation before holding up a hand. "You want to plant trees on my rock pile? Hazels and oaks?" "Yes, ma'am, and you'll pay me for the privilege. 400 an acre, 20-year lease, paid annually in advance." She looked at him for a while. Then she said, "There's something wrong with you," not unkindly, and had him round to the kitchen table, where she wrote out a lease longhand on lined notebook paper that a lawyer later told Silas was, annoyingly, completely enforceable. She never did understand the project. That is worth being clear about. Because it would be a neater story if she had been a mentor or a believer or a wise old woman who saw what he saw. She wasn't. For 7 years, Ilma Vosberg cashed a check every March for a rock pile and told her son that the young man up on the north end was very polite and probably not well. Tell me where you're watching from. Comments below. I read everyone. And if you have ever put years into something you had no way of checking on, stay with me, because that turns out to be the actual subject of this one. What he planted were 420 seedlings, hazel and bur oak, whose roots had been inoculated in a nursery with the fungus. And here is where I have to slow down and be careful. Because this is the part of the story where the honest version and the exciting version are not the same version. Inoculated truffle seedlings are real and legitimate. You buy them from specialist nurseries at a serious price per tree. What you are buying is a young tree whose root system carries the fungus at the moment of planting. What you are not buying under any circumstances is a guarantee. Truffle orchards fail routinely. They fail because the fungus never properly establishes. They fail because it establishes and is then outcompeted by other fungi already living in that soil. They fail because the pH drifts. They fail because of drought, or because of a hard winter at the wrong moment, or for reasons that nobody can identify afterward even with a laboratory. Plenty of people have planted a truffle orchard, tended it faithfully for a decade, and harvested nothing at all, ever. Those people exist. There are more of them than there are of the other kind, and you do not find out which kind you are for somewhere between 5 and 10 years. That is the actual product Silas Renner bought with $11,000. Not truffles. A wait, with a real and substantial chance of ending in nothing. For the first 3 years there was nothing to do but keep trees alive on ground that dried out fast, which meant hauling water in the worst part of every summer, in a tank on a trailer behind a utility vehicle that was older than he was. He tested soil pH twice a year and limed when it drifted, which it did. He mowed between the rows. He put wood chip mulch on in year 3, and then took it all off again in year 4, because he read something that changed his mind about it. He fenced against deer after losing 31 trees in one winter, which was a bad week and an expense he had not budgeted for. He worked as a substitute teacher, and then at a feed store, and did the orchard on weekends and evenings, and in the hour of light after work in summer. And the whole time, this is the part that would break most people, he had no way to check. You cannot dig up a root system to see how it is doing without damaging the thing you are inspecting. There is no test. There is no meter. You are being asked to spend a decade of your life on a hypothesis you are structurally forbidden from testing. In year 4, he drove 3 hours to see another orchard. A man near the state line had planted about the same time and had answered Silas's email, and Silas went out there half hoping for reassurance. What he found was a 50-year-old machinist standing in 6 acres of perfectly healthy hazel trees, 11 years in the ground, that had never produced a single truffle and never would. The trees were fine. The trees were beautiful. Whatever had been on their roots at planting was simply gone, outcompeted, and there was no way to know when it had happened or why. The man had spent, by his own accounting, something over $60,000. He was not bitter about it. He said it the way farmers say things about hail. Silas drove home with that in the truck with him, and he says it is the only time in the whole thing that he seriously considered stopping. There is one thing you can see, and it is the only thing. In a producing orchard, the ground around the base of a colonized tree goes bare. The fungus suppresses other plants in a ring around the trunk. No grass, no weeds, just clean soil. It is called the brûlé, from the French for burned, because that is what it looks like. A scorch mark on the ground with a healthy tree standing in the middle of it. Its appearance is the first real evidence that anything at all is happening underground. In year 5, walking the rows in September, Silas found a faint one under a hazel at the top of the slope. He crouched down and looked at it for a long time. He did not tell anybody for 2 weeks. He made himself not get excited, because a brûlé is a good sign and not a promise. And he had just spent 3 hours in another man's beautiful 11-year-old orchard that would never produce anything. The dog was the last piece, and the one he had been putting off because dogs cost money and take time, and he was short of both. Ambrose was a Lagotto, the Italian water dog breed that has been used for this work for centuries. Bred specifically for it after the truffle pigs got banned for the obvious reason that a pig that finds a truffle intends to eat it. Silas got him at 14 months, partly trained, from a woman 2 states away who bred them for exactly this and who interviewed Silas on the phone for an hour before she would agree to sell him one. They trained together for 8 months on buried scent. That is a long, slow, unglamorous business of teaching a dog that one particular smell out of the thousands available to him means everything, and that all the rest of them mean nothing at all. By the following autumn, Ambrose could find a scented tin buried a foot down anywhere on that hillside, reliably, in under 2 minutes, which was excellent practice and proved absolutely nothing about whether there was anything real out there to find. It happened in the 2nd week of December in year 7, in the cold, on an ordinary walk of the rows that Silas had done several hundred times. Ambrose stopped. He put his nose down at the base of a hazel, about 2/3 of the way up the slope, in a patch of bare scorched ground, and he started to dig, not the casual excavation of a bored dog, but the specific focused digging he had been taught. Then he sat back and looked at Silas. That was the signal. Silas got down and moved the dog aside, and went in with a small hand tool, carefully, because the thing you are digging for can be 4-inch cores down, and can be ruined by hitting it with anything. What came up was black, lumpy, about the size of a walnut, crusted with wet soil, warty and irregular and utterly unmistakable. He held it up, and the smell came off it into the cold air, and he sat down on the ground on that useless hillside and cried, with the dog watching him, which he has admitted publicly since, and does not seem embarrassed about. They found 9 that afternoon. The largest was 60 grams. Then he had 9 truffles in a bowl on his kitchen table and no idea on earth how to sell them. That is not a small problem, and nobody warns you about it. A truffle is worthless in about 10 days. It loses weight, it loses aroma, and the thing people pay for is the aroma. You cannot store it, you cannot freeze it usefully, and there is no wholesaler in that part of the country, because there has never been anything for a wholesaler to buy. So on the 2nd day, Silas Renner looked up the phone numbers of every restaurant within a 3-hour drive that he judged might plausibly care, which came to 11 of them, and started calling. The first 4 thought it was a sales call and hung up. The 5th was a line cook who took a message that never got passed on. The 6th was a chef who listened for about 15 seconds and then said, "Wait, you grew them? Here." He drove them up that afternoon in a cooler on the passenger seat at a speed his truck was not entirely comfortable with. She met him at the back door, took the bowl, and did the thing every single buyer has done since. She picked one up, held it under her nose, and went completely still for about 4 seconds. Then she asked him what he wanted for them. He had learned by then not to guess. He asked her what the going rate was for imports of that quality, and she told him honestly. And then she told him what she would pay for something harvested that morning 2 hours away, instead of flown in from another continent 4 days earlier. The second number was higher than the first. That is the whole economics of it, and it took him 7 years and 1 phone call to find out. The thing he had, that the importers could not match, was not price. It was hours. Everything they sold had spent 4 days in transit, losing the only property anybody was paying for. He has sold to that kitchen every season since. Here is what that is actually worth, because this is where these stories usually go stupid. Fresh black truffles of good quality, sold direct to restaurants, run in the range of $800 to $1,500 a kilogram, depending on the season, the size, and the quality of what you have. Not 5,000, not 10,000. Those numbers get thrown around by people confusing black truffles with the white Italian ones, which are a completely different species, with a different market, and which nobody has ever managed to cultivate at all. Every white truffle in the world is still found wild. That first harvest, a partial one, off a handful of producing trees in the first year of production, came to under 3 kilograms across the entire season. It was at that point the most money that Hillside had produced in 90 years. 6 years later, the orchard produces somewhere between 40 and 70 kilos in a good season. How good the season is depends almost entirely on rainfall in late summer, which Silas cannot control and has stopped pretending to predict. In a bad year, it is half that. It supports him, one part-time employee, and the dog. It is a living, not a fortune, and it took him 13 years from planting to get there. Ilma Vosberg died at 89 and left the 9 acres to her son, who renewed the lease and raised the rent, which Silas thought was entirely fair and paid without comment. Ambrose is 9 now and works about half as hard as he used to. There is a younger dog learning the rows behind him, and Ambrose has opinions about that. Twice a week from November through February, a small insulated box goes out from a limestone hillside that nobody wanted. 2 hours later, a chef takes what is inside out of it and sets it on a scale that reads to 1/10 of a gram. A black, lumpy, soil-crusted thing that grew in ground too poor for corn, on rock that broke plows for 90 years, in a place that was only ever worthless to people who were trying to grow something else.